Hello everyone. Welcome to this NABS talk with Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman, McCann Group UK. I'll be introducing Rory properly in a few minutes, but first I just want to say a few things about NABS and say a few thank yous, because they're important. The first thing I want to say is thank you for coming tonight. Obviously it's a very special day for Manchester today, so for you to give up your time and come tonight I think is wonderful. This time last year we all know what happened, and the following day I was putting on another one of these talks and I wondered whether I should cancel it or not. And everyone said no, don't, because the Manchester spirit is carry on. So that's what we're doing tonight. So I think maybe we should give a round of applause just in memory. Firstly, I'd like to say a massive thank you to McCann Manchester for hosting this evening for us. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to come here, this fantastic building, these wonderful surroundings, and we wouldn't have been able to accommodate so many of you. These things cost money, and they've really enabled us to do that. So thank you very much, McCann Manchester. Thank you. You can applaud them if you like. Actually, for the first time ever, we've got a few empty seats, but that could be they're not here yet, or for whatever reason. We've actually had a waiting list, so no pressure on you, Rory. People really want to hear what you've got to say. We're also live streaming this talk for the first time ever to Weber Shandwick in Glasgow. Hello. Hello, Glasgow. Where we have an eager audience awaiting what Rory has to say. I think they've got pizza as well, so you're really jealous because we're not giving that to you, I'm afraid. I feel like I'm presenting the Eurovision Song Contest. So hello, anyway, it's great to be able to share this with you in Glasgow, because we really feel as though we need to strengthen our relationship with you, because we help people all over the country, including Scotland. And I know you're a slightly separate country from us, controversial, but we do support people in Scotland, and so your support of us is really important. So thank you for coming along tonight. At NABS, our mission is to support and champion the well-being of everyone working in advertising and media nationwide. We do this in lots of different ways. It's brief. We run masterclasses on building resilience to pressure, helping improve your confidence and gravitas, building rapport and influence, leadership skills, working parents, etc., all manner of things that we're doing these days, which some of you may not even realise. Go on our website, the address is up there, and just have a look around, because you might be surprised at what you find. We run a one-to-one mentoring scheme, and we've also just launched a very successful speed mentoring event with some people who are here tonight and know took part in it, and the feedback was fantastic. We have also recently hired a career coach who's working here on the ground in Manchester. So if anyone fancies some advice from a proper, fully trained coach, get on the website and book your time in with her. She's fantastic and you'll really enjoy it and benefit from it. In addition, as many of you will know, we have a confidential advice line which is there for any of you to use. It doesn't matter whether you give to NABS, you are part of our community, so you can benefit from what it is that we do for you. We support people through just about any kind of issue, work-related, personal, always finding the best ways to help give you support and help. It could be anything from stress to financial advice, from cognitive behavioural therapy to retraining grants, just anything you can throw at us, we will help you. We've been supporting people in the industry for over 100 years, and I'm sure you will agree we're very lucky to have this organisation working in support of us. There are ways that you can help. I'm not asking you for money, but I'm asking for you to get involved. Come to our events, you're already doing that today. But also, volunteer to be a NABS ambassador. There's just one of me, and I'm only part-time, and I need advocates for NABS throughout the industry. So if you feel like volunteering to be one of these marvellous people to help me spread the word and get people using this and getting involved, you can apply to be one via the NABS website. Please do have a look and have a think about it. I've nearly finished all the NABS stuff. Or just get involved and tell your friends, you know, that word of mouth, as we all know in this industry, is more powerful almost than anything else you can do, so please use your voices. Sign up for the newsletter, which you can do online, run your own events, raise some money for us. Thanks for coming. We're also very much about bringing the community, the whole community together. and working with our wide network of senior supporters to impart knowledge, wisdom and inspiration. And that's what tonight is all about. I'm now going to introduce you to the inimitable, if I may call you that, Rory Sutherland. I looked it up in the thesaurus and I think it's quite accurate. Rory is vice chairman, he says, an attractive and vague job title, which has allowed him to co-found Oglivy Change, a behavioural science practice. Rory co-heads a team of psychology graduates who look for unseen opportunities, in consumer behaviour. These are the very small contextual changes which can have enormous effects on the decisions that people make. For instance, tripling the sales rate of a call centre by adding just a few sentences to the script. Put another way, lots of agencies will talk about bought, owned and earned media. I still don't understand what that is. No, I do. We also look for inventive media and discovered media, seeking out those unexpected and inexpensive nudges that transform the way that people think and act. Before founding Oglivy Change, Rory was a copywriter and creative director at Oglivy for over 20 years, having joined as a graduate trainee in 1988. Sorry to remind you. He's variously been president of the IPA, chair of the judges for the direct jury at McCann, and has spoken at TED Global. He writes regular columns for The Spectator, Market Leader and Impact, and also occasional pieces for Wired. He's married to a vicar and has twin daughters of 17. He lives in the former home of Napoleon III. I was told in the attic.
Yeah, in the attic.
Right, okay. Interesting. He's a trustee of the Benjamin Franklin House in London and of Rochester Cathedral. For anyone who's seen Rory before, you'll know that you're in for a treat. And for anyone who hasn't seen him before, you really are in for a treat. Rory.
Thank you very much. I was just going to ask, if there are any web designers in the room, which there are probably quite a few, one real favour from someone aged 53 when you mentioned that you started as a graduate trainee in 1988. When you have one of those scroll down menus where you have to put in your year of birth, can you default it around kind of 1970, 1973? Because you're all 23 years old and they all start date of birth 2003, which means if you're born in 1965, you have this incredibly depressing experience of scrolling all the way back to 1965. And every time I do it, it makes me sad. So a tiny favour to anybody in the room involved in web design. Anybody here, by the way, connected to the internet will have seen 2 or 3 of these slightly amusing, slightly annoying memes going around. One of them involving Yanni and what was the other one? Laurel, okay? And the other one, I think, involving green needle. And what's the other word? Can anybody remember? Well, perfect. Now, what was interesting about the second one was, depending on which word you expected, you heard 2 completely different things. It was actually more impressive in many ways than the Yanni one, because the priming, I couldn't hear Laurel, still haven't. Can't hear it at all. That may be because as you're, by the way, as you get older, the range of frequency of your hearing changes. And there may be significant age effects in that. But I could hear both of those words depending on which one I was expecting. What I couldn't do is hear them both at the same time. Now, what I want to explain to you, I suppose, in this talk is that actually most human perceptions are a bit like that. What we actually perceive, what we think, what we feel, isn't an independent thing that's a product of what economists would call utility, a product, okay? You know, intrinsic value. Everything's a bit subjective like that, that what we think of something entirely depends on what we expect. In other words, there's no really independent value that anything possesses that's isolated from human perception. Now, what's worrying about that is that you could say, well, nothing's either good nor bad, but only thinking makes it so, as Shakespeare said. You know, that seems, you know, sort of almost sort of anarchic view of what value is. The good news, and that's good news, I would argue, for marketers, it's also good news for environmentalists, is it means you can sometimes, through a kind of marketing alchemy, just synthesize value out of nowhere. In other words, you can make something more valuable not by changing what something is, but by simply changing the way people look at it. And that's fantastic. It's fantastic in many ways because if you think about marketing value, the value that marketing generates, all you need to generate marketing value, you don't need to dig precious metals, pull rare earths out of the ground, burn fossil fuels. You just need a few electrons or a tiny few drops of ink, and it's job done. And so what I was going to talk about is this thing which I magically call it. I don't know where that's coming from. That's a glorious, update failed. That'll be exciting. Okay, I'm going to talk about this thing. By the way, you'll notice, because we look for unseen, hidden value, hidden opportunities, there isn't really a letter N in our logo. The mind creates it. The sense-making part of the mind creates an N from nowhere because you expect that to be in the word change and because the two little spikes imply it. This is just a tiny example of what we call innovation. Innovation isn't a spelling mistake. It's the idea that just as you can innovate in the physical world by working out what people want and finding an ingenious way to make it, you can innovate in the psychological world by essentially working out what you can make and finding an ingenious way to make people want it. And since the purpose of business and the purpose of many, many things, involving any form of behavioral change, is, to change people's behavior, it genuinely doesn't matter which way round you do that. Now, sometimes I think one of the important conclusions we've come to working in Oglivy Change is that maybe some of the environmental movements got it wrong. Because they have this belief that the only way to get people to engage in what you might call pro-social, environmentally beneficial behavior is to first convert them into passionate tree huggers. And we're not sure. Our argument would be actually in many cases, and this is obviously a weird one, in many cases people's attitudes are formed by their behavior rather than the other way around. If you make it easy for people to recycle, they recycle because it's easy, and then because they recycle, they become in favor of recycling. In many ways, actually, if you look at, with two exceptions, apparently there have only been two really blockbuster drugs in the history of medicine that are total game changers in any particular field. And the two are on two extremes, arguably of the usefulness scale, antibiotics and Viagra. Most of the increase in human lifespan, human life expectancy, has actually come through better diet and hygiene rather than through better medicine. Not all of it, but probably the greater part. Now, if you look at Unilever ads from the 1930s, which are encouraging people to be more hygienic, what they don't say is wash with pear soap and avoid a cholera outbreak. They essentially sell soap on status. The idea that a clean home is of higher status than a dirty home. They sell actually on, hideously in many cases, on social anxiety. The phrase, always the bridesmaid, never the bride, is actually from a Listerine advertisement of the 1930s. But in order to get people to adopt a behavior, it isn't necessary to get them to adopt what you assume to be the attitude first. You can do it backwards. And it's a really important point, which is I think advertising's made this terrible mistake where it always assumes that attitude precedes behavior. Now, my argument is if you can shortcut straight to the behavior, the why actually is secondary. In many cases, actually, the why is supplied by the person himself. In most cases, I think, our actions are determined unconsciously, and then we post-rationalize. We come up with a plausible-sounding explanation afterwards. I know it's a slightly depressing view of human nature, but I think it's more often that way around than the other. And so innovation is interesting because essentially just as innovation happens when you discover an interesting property of silicon or an interesting property of fiber optic cable or an interesting property of the wheel or fire, okay? Innovation is the same thing, only it's finding interesting properties of the human mind. And designing the world around the human mind is hardly a ridiculous thing to do. It's kind of all we've got. So one of the things that upsets me is when I started Oglivy Change, I realized that ad agencies, PR agencies, design agencies, all have within them that mixture of insight and creativity, which can actually solve 10 times more problems than we're ever asked to solve. And part of the problem is no one, in the case of an ad agency, we've done this stupid thing where for 30 years we haven't been paid on commission. For 30 years we're paid by fee. And yet the muscle memory of an ad agency is so strong that people still feel, well, if we don't produce a communication here, we're kind of cheating. And it's actually self-defeating, because nobody then goes to talk to an ad agency unless they've got a media budget. Now, my view is for every person with a problem and a media budget, there are 100 people who've got a problem but haven't got a media budget. Since we're not paid by media commission anymore, the way to grow the advertising and marketing disciplines is actually not in scale, it's growing them sideways. We need to learn to talk to people who aren't in the marketing department at all, effectively. We need to learn to talk to people and say, if you've got a problem in which humans are involved, maybe we can help. And let me explain why what you do is so important. I mean, I always say of an ad agency, it's a bit like having a general hospital which has this sign out front that says cosmetic surgery. You know, actually, a mixture of really good human insight and creativity can solve loads and loads of problems. Sometimes it involves communication, sometimes it involves bought media, sometimes it doesn't. But we've kind of talked ourselves into a corner where instead of actually solving larger problems, we're kind of positioned ourselves as, hey, we do butt lifts for brands. And I think we've trivialized ourselves. Once you understand a little bit of behavioral science, which puts all this into context, what you start to realize is that there are you can use this insight into how people really think, decide, and act, not just to solve relatively small problems like call center conversion, where just adding a few words. In this case, it was people had to choose on the phone which option they wanted. And we just added the words, most people choose B, but if you prefer, you can have A or C. And once there was a social norm added to the question, people seem to find it twice as easy to choose. Because we don't actually choose as economists think we choose, we quite often choose in reference to other people. We can't buy a brand of car, weirdly, if we don't like the people we think drive it. You know. And so my great excitement is that what you bring as a skill base, and by the way, you've got to have a huge advantage coming from Manchester. I had a huge advantage starting in direct marketing, which is you learn how weird consumer behaviour is. Because you're actually, the lucky thing about being in Manchester, not London, is you're actually at a sensible scale where your advertising actually has to work, okay? You know, in London there's a kind of weird escape velocity of ad campaigns that are produced almost for kind of reasons of internal politics. You're actually in the sensible business where if your advertising doesn't work, it's considered a failure. I learned a huge amount of direct marketing because so often, I think the real skill is anomaly detection. And the great thing about direct marketing was that so often the results didn't seem to make sense. I'll give you a lovely example, by the way. We recently ran 2 prize draws about 3 months apart. In one of them, the actual prize was a year's free energy worth well, over £1,000. Okay, it's by a large utility. 3 months later, we ran a prize draw where the prize was a Penguin nightlight worth about £15. First prize draw got about 63,000 entries. The second prize draw got over 300,000. Okay. Now, actually, funnily enough, my friends who are evolutionary psychologists find that interesting because actually, weirdly, giving something really cute to your kid may be actually a greater motivation than having something for yourself. By the way, actually, I think an evolutionary psychologist, the one really big learning from advertising, which is too embarrassing for us to admit, is probably that ads that feature animals are more successful than ads that don't. And if you actually added up all the ad campaigns in history, that would be one of the very few absolutely unambiguous findings, I think. Now, of course, if you think about advertising being about attention, that's an evolutionary thing. We have fairly obvious reasons evolved to pay disproportionate attention to living things. You know, any kind of animal which could be a meal or could be cute or could be about to attack us deserves more of our attention than anything else. And that would hardly be an unusual feature of the evolved brain. But the reason that creative, what I call dissonant thinking is so important now, and really, really important, is it's not like there's a shortage of logical people. We're not living in the Middle Ages, okay? And I genuinely believe this. Most of the remaining problems that persist in society, persist because they're logic proof. As I said, if there were a logical answer, we would already have found it. I've got a very mischievous thing. I hate things that aren't dishwasher proof. It just annoys me. It's a pain in the arse. So much to the annoyance of my wife, I suggested a very simple way to solve this problem. I said, if we treat everything in our house, in our kitchen, as if it's dishwasher proof, 2 years later, everything that survives will be. It's kind of dishwasher Darwinism, okay? And in the same way, there are loads and loads of people at McKinsey, there are loads of economists, there are loads of politicians, there are loads and loads of people who've had a background in physics or chemistry or some sort of logical discipline who are given all the world's problems to solve first. And they use basically some form of conventional logic. And what that means fantastically is that the problems that persist, like the things that survive my dishwasher, are kind of logic proof. And what we've got to do in the world is find a world in which we can have permission to think counterintuitive thoughts. The real value of any kind of marketing agency or being in a marketing department should be that you have to first create an environment in which you can make stupid suggestions and still get promoted. Okay? Because quite often, actually, it's a very weird thing. Actually, the dumb thing 1 time in 10 is weirdly the right answer. I had to go into HMRC and the Cabinet Office and explain that actually, weirdly, increasing the amount that people can save in a pension reduces the likelihood that most people will save in a pension. Now, economists would go practically sick at this. The way I explained it, okay, is let's assume you could only get a tax rebate on £2,000 a year. Every year you didn't put in the maximum amount, you might feel you were missing out. Okay? Shit, that 2,000 opportunity, that window's gone and it's never going to come again. Raise the threshold as they have done to something like 20 or 30,000, okay? And, well, I've got flaming years to put that money in, okay? So other than the very, very rich, raising the actual threshold of saving, one of the reasons ISAs were so potent as a savings vehicle is you had an opportunity to give to put money in once a year, and if you lost it forever. If you make the ISA threshold annually too large, all but super rich people find it less motivating than they did before. That's what I mean by sometimes actually the opposite of logic is what you need. And I'll make an explanation. I'll give a few stories about this. This is a typical kind of logic-proof problem, okay? So the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., the masonry is crumbling. I think at one stage a tourist was nearly killed by a bit of falling stonework. And they said, why is this problem happening? It doesn't happen to the other buildings. They said, it's because we have to spray clean it very frequently. And the water gets into the cracks, sometimes the water freezes, it widens the cracks, lumps of masonry and stonework fall off. And eventually they said, okay, why do we have to clean it so often? Because it gets covered in bird shit. And they tried bird nets, and they didn't work very well, and in any case it pissed off tourists. If you travel 2,000 miles to see this thing, you don't really expect to see it covered in netting, okay? So then finally someone asked the next question, which is, they said, why does it get covered in bird shit? And someone said, the birds come to eat the spiders. And then they asked the next why. Why are there so many spiders? They tried insecticide, by the way, and it worked for a time, but then the spiders either evolved immunity or they started coming back. Oh, the spiders come to eat the midges. They got the hang of it by now. Why are there so many midges? Finally, they went to an entomologist called Donald Messerschmitt, who said, because the building's floodlit. So Washington, D.C., I don't know if you've been there, it's basically built in a swamp. Okay, and it's, they're huge midges, basically, that are attracted by the light after nightfall and fly towards the building, where the spiders go to eat them, where the birds go to eat the spiders, where the birds then shit out the spiders, and then they have to be sprayed off. Now, if you'd said there's a problem with the solution is either to turn this floodlighting on later or to change the colour of the floodlighting so it's less appealing to midges. Actually, the people in Glasgow will be finding the anti-midge tips particularly valuable, I think, won't they? But the point there is that if you said, we've got a problem with crumbling masonry, what do we need to do? I know we need to change the floodlighting. You sound like a lunatic, don't you? Okay. Many, many logic-proof persistent problems persist because they're like that. The real cause of the problem is somewhere else. It's oblique. It's not direct. And it's often the talent of a creative person to come up with the oblique solution rather than the direct one. And so these are all examples of things which in a glorious way just don't make sense at all. When human behavior or animal behavior is involved, the usual rules of logic don't apply. Okay? So this is a case where something borrowed from, never forget this, something borrowed from like the life insurance industry, pretty much, which is a free gift. And in this case, when you've completed the series of vaccinations for your child, you get a set of plates, okay? If you look at the effect, a 6-fold increase in immunization relative to the comparison group. This is done by a woman called Esther Duflo at MIT, very brilliant French experimental economist. Now, if you're cynical, you could say, Esther, we've known that for ages. People aren't very motivated by things that are intangible. You know, if you sell life insurance, you've got to give people a free clock radio, because they just really hate the idea of spending money on something you can't see or touch. But that is, when you think about it, incredibly strange. Because if you sat down in a meeting with a bunch of logical people and you said, how do you persuade people to vaccinate their children? Every single person would go, you tell them their children won't die if they're vaccinated. And yet, weirdly, that is less effective than a bizarre kind of sales promotion tactic. You know, I think we should actually stop being ashamed of these things. You know, we've got a huge body of knowledge about what actually motivates people to do things. And actually, it can solve much bigger problems than selling life insurance. But as to why that is, I genuinely don't know. Here's my suggestion if you want people to finish antibiotics. Don't give them 24 white pills, give them 20 white pills and 4 blue ones. They're identical inside, right? Just say, when you finish the white ones, take the blue ones. People won't want to start taking the blue ones early, but they'll feel if I don't take the blue ones, it feels wrong, so they'll complete the course. Now again, you know, how is it that that is more potent than the exercise of reason and a whole explanation about the dangers of kind of microbial resistance? Look, I mean, if you've learned nothing else in your job that people are really fucking weird, actually, that's a surprisingly important finding, because nearly all decisions in politics and in business are taken on the basis that people are completely rational. And so, this is probably my favorite example, right? You want to compete with Coca-Cola. You go into a room and someone says, you know, Coke's been the most popular cold non-alcoholic drink for the last X years. We really need to compete with Coke. You say, okay, we need a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big container, so people get great value for money. And no one's going to throw you out of the room because you've obeyed fundamental business rules, which is no one ever gets fired for pretending everything's rational. But the most successful attempt to compete with Coke in 150 years is that. It comes in a tiny can, it costs a fortune, and it tastes disgusting. Now, there is a deeper reason, I think, and I've talked to people at INSEAD who research this. If you want the human brain to think that something has medicinal, health-giving, or psychotropic, psychoactive powers, it has to taste weird. Do you see what I mean? You know, I don't trust Nurofen meltlets because they're too tasty. You know those lemon ones? They can't really work as an analgesic because to be an effective pill, it's got to taste horrible. And actually, Sanatogen, if anybody remembers it, the last chemical they added to Sanatogen, which was a tonic wine, was a chemical that just didn't taste very nice. That was the only function of the chemical, because they said no one believes this is a health product unless it tastes a bit weird. I mean, if you take the counterpoint, you know, wheatgrass must be good for us because it tastes like shit, doesn't it? I mean, you might as well just lick the underside of your lawnmower. And so, with any psychological problem, this is a really important distinction. With any problem involving human psychology, there's going to be a degree of second order, third order, fourth order, why and what. It isn't a simple physics problem. And this is a really important point. There are two kinds of problems in the world. There are ones where living organisms aren't involved and where you can define success in totally inorganic terms. So building a bridge, this is a magnificent bridge, Brunel's Bridge at Maidenhead over the Thames, but the definition of the bridge can be, a successful bridge, can be defined without any reference to a living organism. Does it bear the weight of a train travelling over it at a certain speed when the train weighs so much? Either the bridge stands up or the bridge falls down, okay? Now, you can make a bridge more attractive or less attractive, but that's not fundamental to whether it's a bridge or not. And there are very large parts, you know, space programs, space probes. A large part of science has gained its credibility and success by focusing on that kind of problem, problems which are totally human-free. Okay? But then there are other forms of science where essentially, well, it's a bit weird, the normal logical rules don't apply. Now, anything where humans are involved breaks the conventional view of logic. Now, this is one of my favorite little comic moments from one of my favorite films. Now, what you need to understand when you watch this is it's very, very funny, but it's actually funny for a clever reason. I'll explain what that is in a second.
Maybe we ought to turn on the searchlights now. It's just what we expected.
Now, for those of you who are either young or have never seen a film, that's Airplane. And there's a plane, a civilian aircraft coming into land. And of course, the guy in the control tower wants to turn on the runway lights, so it's easier for this highly inexpert pilot to land a plane with which he's unfamiliar. The joke there is not entirely a joke. Because the guy who says, no, that's exactly what, I think he's called Kramer, the guy who says, no, that's exactly what they're expecting us to do, of course, is ex-military. He's ex-Korean War. Now, if you think about military strategy, which is something that involves humans, you can't be conventionally logical in any military strategy, because if you're logical, you're predictable, and if you're predictable, you're dead, okay? That's why they didn't get procurement to decide on the landing place for the D-Day landings, right? Because they would have just said, no, it has to be at Calais, because it'll minimize fuel costs. What you have to do if you want to actually wrong foot somebody is you have to engage in some clever irrationality. You have to do something that doesn't make sense. And there's an argument that just says that humans can't be completely rational because any animal that's completely rational would become hackable. You'd be able to predict exactly what it would do under given circumstances. There are certain aspects of human behavior which probably have to be random, like anger. Because if you never got angry, people would dick you around. The reason people don't dick you around is because there's always that faint chance you'll totally lose it. Now, you may be smaller than them and weaker than them, but you could still do enough damage to be a significant pain. And so a degree of randomness and unpredictability is probably necessary in human behavior simply for reasons of survival. And so in military strategy, it's the same. That's where you have game theory rather than conventional logic. And actually marketing is often like that, because one of the dangers about being completely logical about your marketing is you end up in the same place as all your competitors, which is the most crowded part of the market. All people who essentially start a really interesting, significant new business probably start it by stumbling on something, some metric that all their competitors haven't noticed as important. McDonald's, if you think about it, the standard American diner was all about range of choice. And McDonald's came along and said, we're going to ignore all that, we're going to have actually virtually no bloody choice at all, but it's going to be really fast. Okay? So, quite a lot of innovation actually happens where you ignore the axioms and assumptions of the category in which you compete. And that is, again, a kind of game theoretic thing. No, that's exactly what they'll expect us to do, is not a bad criticism of a piece of advertising. And so, oops, sorry, other things. I mentioned there's a bridge. You can determine whether a bridge is any good or not by whether it stands up or falls down. There's no human subjectivity involved. Interestingly, other pieces of technology are much more subjective than you realize. Did you know that your telly is actually optimized for higher primates? So when you design a TV, the reason it has red, green, and blue isn't because of some law of physics. It's because the human eye is sensitive to red, green, and blue. Your dog thinks your TV is shit, okay? I think dogs mostly see, it might be blue and yellow or something strange like that. There's some very strange combination, but they don't see the same colors we do. Now, obviously, when you go into, curries, TVs don't say specially optimized for higher primates, because dogs don't buy many televisions. But actually, the mixing, color mixing like that, that is not a physical phenomenon. If you mix blue and red photons, you do not get purple photons. Okay? You get a mixture of blue and red photons. The purple is created in the human brain, not in the real world. And interestingly, that color, in fact, doesn't exist in the real world anyway. I'll just explain that very quickly. This is roughly the sensitivity of the human and I think gorilla eye. And it has sensors for red, sensors for green, and sensors for blue. When it gets red and green in roughly equal measure, it compromises on the spectrum and goes, well, that's kind of yellow. Now you think when it picks up blue and red, it would go, well, halfway between blue and red, I'll make that green. And indeed it should do that, except it has sensors for green and it isn't picking up any. So the brain invents a color, magenta, that has no existence in the physical world at all to make sense of the inexplicable absence of green. So technically you should say to someone in a purple dress, or the Pope or whatever, okay, that's a beautifully not green thing you're wearing. Because actually purple doesn't really exist. You know, if we were androids, instead of purple we might get a sort of grey fuzzy thing and it says system error, if you see what I mean. Okay? So it doesn't make any sense. So the brain just goes, I'm just going to create a colour out of that. And so that's what we see on telly. If you had a screen optimised for birds, which see much further into the ultraviolet spectrum, you know, the bird would look at that picture and go, that doesn't look like anything like a flaming lake. Looks completely crap to me. So if you had a TV made for your parrot, I think pigeons might actually see 5 colours. So pigeon tellies would be really, really expensive because you'd have to have 5 different things. That's what you'd actually see. And human perception is really, really weird. I mean, when I say really weird, I mean really, really weird. So if you look at those things, you see green things and blue things spiraling alternately. They're exactly the same color, they're both green. But the human brain finds it more important to detect contrast than to detect absolutes, because it's spotting a weird little contrast that probably kept our ancestors alive. You know, the ancestors we might have had who all had Pantone reference books in their head, they got eaten, okay? Similarly, the brain creates white there. If you put your fingers up to your eyes, so you cover the join between the top half of that hinged thing and the bottom half of the hinged thing, you may need 3 fingers or just 2. Bring them a little bit nearer and closer. You'll see that in objective terms, the top and bottom of that thing are exactly the same shade of grey. But your brain's going, I better make it white because it's probably in shadow, so I need to compensate. So your brain's distorting reality all over the place just to make sense of the world. You all saw that thing with green needle. Here's another thing which actually everybody needs to see, because you understand that actually what we perceive is entirely constructed by our brains, really to help us make sense of the world. What you've got to remember about evolution, evolution doesn't give a shit about accuracy, it only cares about fitness. So if you can gain 2 or 3% of fitness by sacrificing 20% of accuracy, your brain will make that trade-off every single time. Oops.
We are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba. Ba.
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
Ba.
Take another look.
Ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba.
Now to the left of the screen.
Ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear.
So exactly like that green needle thing, your eyes are telling your ears what to hear. Just to resolve, it's a bit like error correction in IT, you know. I seem to have heard a bar, but I'm seeing far, and the brain just, beyond our control or beyond our awareness, just basically goes, okay, it's more likely you've misheard than you've misseen, so I'm just going to overwrite that B with an F. I've got a friend who's got progressive deafness, progressively losing her hearing. And she didn't realize for ages that this was happening because completely unconsciously, she was getting really good at lip reading. So as her hearing progressively deteriorated, her eyes basically compensated from what she wasn't hearing by getting better and better at interpolating the sounds. So she didn't even notice. That's how weird it is. And so what you've got to realize is that what appears inside our heads is not an exact facsimile. There's a whole bunch of scientists, okay? This is why it's really, really dangerous not factoring in perception. You don't have to factor in perception when you build a bridge. When you build a television, you do. There were some scientists who were doing experiments on birds by showing them photographs. And birds would occasionally look at a photograph of a ripe banana and get totally unexcited, and the scientists were completely baffled by this, until they realized that all the photographs were optimized for humans, because print is exactly like television. It's optimized for red, green, and blue vision. And what looked like a yellow banana to the scientists looked like a completely unripe banana to the birds. It's a really important point in market research that if you're attempting to research things without understanding what's being perceived, then actually it's a big, big data question. You know, is some of our finding going to be dumb because of the assumption of objective perception? So just to be clear about that, this is a horrible sentence, but I don't know a better way of saying it. You can do great marketing by looking for things that are the same thing but can be made to feel different, or are different things which can be made to seem the same. Just to give you an example, I'm very big on humans really, really hate uncertainty. The best thing the London Underground did per pound spent to improve passenger satisfaction wasn't faster, more frequent trains, it was dot matrix displays on the platform. We'd rather wait 9 minutes for a train knowing it's 9 minutes than wait 3 minutes for a train not knowing. Okay? So just to give you an example of this, one of our clients makes appointments with people, and like all utility companies, it gives them a morning or an afternoon. And everybody in research goes, I really hate it. It's a morning or an afternoon. Can't you be more precise than that? You know, I want a 1 hour window, blah, blah, it's terrible. And then they say things like, it's terrible, I've got to take a whole day off work. Now, call me Mr. Cynical, but that's when I suspect people are starting to bullshit, because let's be honest, people love taking a bloody day off work, okay? Right? Okay? Now, what we actually said is, don't try and do a 1 hour window, it will cost you a fortune. You can get 90% of the perceptual gain and customer satisfaction if you just say, we'll come sometime between 9 and 1 and we'll text you about an hour before we arrive. Now that costs 10p. To do 1 hour delivery slots when you're not quite sure how long each engineer's visit's going to take would cost you tens of thousands of pounds in wasted engineer time. But the point is that waiting around not knowing when the guy is going to come at all is a bit like being under house arrest. You can't have a bath, you can't get in the shower, you can't go around the corner for a pint of milk. The second you know you're going to get a bit of advance notice when he's on his way, the whole psychological feeling changes, even though the objective reality is exactly the same. And that's what we kind of mean by innovation. Now, I discovered a fantastic example of this. I always hate it when you land on a plane and they get you a bus. You know, you're like a mile from the terminal and you hear the engines wind down and everybody on the plane, as of one, goes, oh shit, it's going to be a bus. And then one day this EasyJet pilot, just as we came into land, said, I've got bad news and good news. The bad news is that we haven't been able to get an air bridge because there's a plane blocking our gate. But the good news is that the bus will take you all the way to passport control so you won't have far to walk with your bags. We looked at each other and thought, that's weird, because that's always true. But I'd never known there was an upside before, because no one had told me. Now, once you tell people there's some bad news and there's some good news, a very reliable mental bias called adaptive preference formation kicks in, where you over-focus on the upside and you minimize the downside in order to make yourself happier, basically. It's like sour grapes in reverse, you know what I mean? The Aesop fable of the sour grapes. It's adaptive preference formation where if we end up with, you know, that's good about this, that's good about that, and we end up with that, we end up deciding that the good bit of the thing we chose is much, much better, and the thing we actually went without is much, much more trivial. It's, you know, it's a form of self-delusion in a way, but it keeps us happy. Anything you can do, so suddenly the bus try this next time you get a bus on a plane. Just say very loudly to your companion, actually, I'm glad there's a bus because it takes you all the way to passport control and you don't have to walk through a sodding shopping centre with your bags to get out of the airport. And everybody around you, you'll have synthesized a little bit of happiness. Okay? At no cost, at no environmental cost, but you have created value simply by redirecting attention. And another example of this, Wagamama. Now, you know, if you go into Wagamama and they don't know you, they always do that. Have you ever been to Wagamama before? Have you noticed that? Okay. Now, if you say no, they'll say, what you need to understand is that Wagamama is based on an authentic Japanese noodle bar, which means that the food arrives instantly, fresh and hot, straight from the kitchen, but not necessarily in the order you'd expect. Now, by managing your expectations and getting you to focus on fresh and hot, not totally random food delivery, okay? Now, they've got one big advantage, which is when you claim to be Japanese, people will accept any level of weirdness, won't they, okay? You know, it's a bit odd, pornography with sea creatures. I wouldn't have thought, oh, it's Japanese, right, okay, right? I'm not even sure that's true. I've got Japanese friends who say that at Tokyo noodle bars, you know, you don't have that business where the duck gyoza that you ordered as a starter turns up with your coffee. But by getting you to accept in advance, if they didn't have that little reframing sentence at the beginning, that little bit of storytelling, my hunch is that half the people who went to Wagamama for the first time would leave thinking it was crap. They go, totally incompetent restaurant, they don't know what the hell they're up to, you know, I order the thing as a starter, practically arrives with my coffee, you know, I don't know what they're doing. But by making it seem both intentional and a trade-off, because the food does arrive fresh and hot, you accept something which, without that tiny little bit of marketing spin, would normally be in a French restaurant, oh, by the way, we'll bring you, sorry about this, your soup's coming in another half hour, right? Okay, that would be totally unacceptable. And so the same thing can be good or bad depending on how we think of it. If you buy a Ferrari, apparently, you can either have the Ferrari delivered, of course you're Mancunian, so you've all got one, haven't you, up in your elderly edge, you know, mega mansions. So you'll know this anyway. But if you order one, you can either have it delivered to your local Ferrari dealership for free, or you can pay £500, fly down to Maranello at your own expense and have a tour of the factory, and then drive your car back home. Now, I don't know if you noticed what they've done there. By calling it a tour of the factory, they've got you to pay them to collect your car at your own expense. How clever is that, right? Now, genuinely, what something's worth is not a product of it's a product of what we compare it to, the context in which we consume it, the context in which we think of it, what we expect from it, you know, green needle, etc. Okay? Nespresso, who's got an espresso machine? Anybody? Yeah, okay. I've got one, love it, it's fantastic, okay? Wouldn't do without it. The one thing is, it's insanely expensive. If you had to buy Nespresso coffee in a jar like Nescafe, for an equivalent caffeine dosage as a large jar of Nescafe, you'd have to pay about £70 for a jar of Nespresso coffee. And you'd look at that on the shelf in Sainsbury's and you go, that's totally insane, there's no way I can pay that, okay? Right? But the thing is, it doesn't come in a jar, it comes in little pods. And every time you put a 29p pod into your Nespresso machine, your frame of reference isn't Nescafe, it's Starbucks. And you think, well, it's 29p, mind you, it cost me £2.20 at Starbucks. This machine's making me money, okay? That the same thing, that's why Rolls-Royce and Maserati stopped exhibiting their cars at car shows, where a €350,000 car looks really expensive. They started exhibiting them at plane shows and yacht shows. If you've been looking at mega yachts and Learjets all afternoon, a €300,000 car is practically an impulse buy. Okay, so what's expensive and what's cheap isn't an absolute function of value, it's very much dependent on what we actually compare it to. Very interesting experiment, by the way. If anybody here really like expensive tea? Nobody? Yeah, exactly, there's someone there who admits it. But if you're in some shop and there's tea which seems like 5 times as expensive as other tea, okay, and you look at that and you go, that's, you know, monkey-picked oolong or whatever, okay, and you look at that and you go, that's totally insane. Here's an interesting price frame to justify it. If you go home and you make that really expensive tea with water from the tap, what you produce as a drink is cheaper than bottled water. And you don't think of bottled water as an extravagance. At least the tea tastes of something, for God's sake, you know. So this is where it gets really, really interesting. Now, a really important point I'm going to make is that marketing always talks about itself as if it adds value. And that suggests there's a value in the product which is immutable and untouchable, and marketing, by adding a bit of fairy dust, adds a bit of extra value. I think that's wrong. I think marketing multiplies value, and it can multiply it down as well as up. A brilliant product presented in the wrong way, priced in the wrong way, described in the wrong way, promoted in the wrong way, loses value. And I think we made this terrible mistake by making marketing added value. It sounds to a client like it's an optional extra. But actually, a great thing that no one's heard of is worthless. A great thing that nobody understands is worthless. A great thing that you promote badly becomes much, much less valuable than before. And I always wanted an example of a brilliant product terribly badly marketed. You know, deliberately take a fantastic product and market it in the worst way possible. And I could never find one until these Australian comedians did this.
Hello, hi. Whee! Peep shows. They have a pretty bad name. Normally associated with lewd content, but by definition, they don't have to be.
So in an attempt to change that, we took one of the world's biggest performing artists, kept all his clothes on, and set up an Ed Sheeran peep show. Would anyone dare to believe what was written outside and come into our very dodgy looking venue?
I don't really know what's going on, Mr.
That was fair enough, because we dressed Hamish as a very shady-looking spruiker in charge of getting customers.
I got Sheeran. Who wants some Sheeran?
Alright, I can hear Hamish.
Do you think I should?
I don't think we'll get it. It's going to be a brave soul.
I would come into, if there was a dude with a beard and a hat and say, I'm not coming in to see this.
Ed was right. This was going to be tough.
Want to peep at Ed Sheeran for $2? Sure. Do you want to peep at Ed Sheeran? You're lost. What do you reckon, big fella? Got Ed Sheeran in here, beautiful ginger headband, sitting on the stool. What do you reckon? $2. Got Ed Sheeran just sitting on a stool and you want $2 for a beat. Think of that. It's actually pretty good value.
Despite trying, we had a total lack of interest for over 50 minutes. It's been so tired. We should have got you a more comfy chair.
Yeah, I'm alright.
Big fella got Ed Sheeran in there, $2. Ed Sheeran in there. Ed Sheeran. Is it a singer? Yeah? Is that a yes? No? I think one of the big problems is people think Ed Sheeran's a code word for a new drug. How's it going? You guys like Ed Sheeran? $2. $2 for a 30-second beat.
What, like they just think that?
Yeah, that's a dirt sheet beat. Dirt sheet beat. There we go, $2.
You do it pricing too high.
See,
$2 is pretty fair.
There we go, boys. It's a Friday. Did you Ed Sheeran peep show? $2. Sitting on a stool, playing a song.
If someone actually does think it's a peep show, and I quickly give you the go-ahead to take pretty close, you will do that.
Been drinking a lot of beer recently.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You know,
A couple of months ago, maybe, but yeah, I'm a bit ashamed, just ashamed to say
2 hours in, and Hamish was getting more desperate.
Ed Sheeran is literally sitting in there on the stage waiting for your $2.
We were feeling it as well, but just when we thought this had been a giant waste of everyone's time.
You guys like Ed Sheeran? You like Ed Sheeran? $2? Big show. Just got him sitting on stage there. Oh, $2. Good. It's going to cost you $2. You only get 30 seconds, right? Okay? Right? Well, I might find out.
We might be lucky.
Here we go. Ed Sheeran.
Baby, my heart still heart 23. And I'm thinking about how people fall in love.
Now, if that seems like a joke, it's worth remembering, if you're in the financial services industry, that's pretty much the situation you're in, okay? Doesn't matter how good your product is, if no one trusts you, no one believes you, if your promise seems incredible or unbelievable, no one's going to buy. And that's what I mean about multiplicative rather than additive. You know, in the absence of trust, actually value disappears. In the absence of sort of brand reputation, value often disappears. No one bought one of those weird Christmas hoverboards because none of them were made by someone who had enough reputation to lose if the things caught fire or were rubbish. Okay? I always thought they were quite good. If Samsung had made one, I would have bought one like a shot. Okay? That's why it's non-additive, it multiplies. And so, there are loads and loads of areas where there's innovation. Yeah, okay, shorter queues are better than longer ones. Actually, if you look at the human brain, there are about 4 or 5 different ways you can make a queue better or worse, which have nothing to do with the length of the queue or the duration of queuing. If the end of the queue is out of sight, it's much more frustrating. If you put little Disney-like things where you go 5 minutes to go, 4 minutes to go, it's less frustrating. A queue that keeps moving is less frustrating than one that grinds to a halt. If you really want to upset people in a queue, just create another queue alongside them that's moving faster than theirs is. Okay? There are lots and lots of factors which determine value, and the objective numerical ones, the ones that appear on a spreadsheet, are only a small number of them. Okay? And they don't capture the full reality. And this attempt to automate marketing by essentially reducing it to kind of painting by numbers is doomed to fail because so many of the things that humans care about don't have a numerical SI unit. There isn't a scientific unit of uncertainty. And probably the most important advice I ever gave in my working life was to British Airways, when I just said, whatever you do when a plane is delayed, I said, don't just put delayed. Said, put delayed 60 minutes, delayed 120 minutes. I mean, you can make it up if you have to. If you're not sure, you know, have your best estimate. Said, people go, okay, delayed 120 minutes, I can go to the lounge, or I can have a meal, or we can ring people and say we're going to be late. Okay? If you just put delayed, they're thinking, well, it probably means it's just going to be cancelled and they're breaking it to us gently. And you go into a complete mental funk. Really, but there isn't an SI unit for uncertainty, so no one measures it. The other thing is, test counterintuitive things because your competitors won't. My methodology for doing behavioural science is basically go, if you presented this problem to a really boring bureaucrat, what would he suggest? And then consider doing the opposite. Really is that simple. Okay? It's to bring a bit of Python-esque weirdness to the things you actually try. Sometimes the opposite of a good idea is also a good idea, by the way. There's a very important thing about human behavior which explains a lot of what humans do and why it seems irrational. We assume that decisions are like a dartboard where you aim for the best, and if you just miss, well, if you just miss a 10, you get a 9. If you miss a 9, you miss an 8. Real world decisions aren't linear like that, where there's an optimal point to which you aim, and then if you just miss, you'll still do pretty well. A lot of decisions involve massive trade-offs. Real world decisions are more like darts, where if you just miss triple 20, you get 1. Do you notice that? The dartboard is not concentric in its scoring. If you just miss triple 20, you don't get triple 19, you get 1 or 5. If you're not very good at darts, by the way, aim at the southwestern quadrant of the board. No, you won't get 60, but you might get triple 19 and you won't get a 1. On average, you'll do better. You'll get thrown out of your darts team because they think you're rubbish. That's called kind of satisfying. That's because in making decisions instinctively, as distinct from making business decisions which we have to justify, we actually care about not only the average outcome but also reducing the variance. Okay? We don't just ask the question, how good is this going to be on average? We actually ask, can I minimize the worst case scenario here? We care about the variance. Now that, I think, is why people pay a premium for brands. I don't think they think brands are better. I think they're more, and David Oglivy was talking about this in the 60s. They buy brand B not because they think it's better, but because they're more sure that it's going to be pretty good. Okay? That's why in many ways McDonald's is the most successful restaurant in the world. It's not a very good restaurant. Not, you know, it's not like you wouldn't go there for your wedding anniversary or the meal of a lifetime, but it's really, really good at not being terrible, okay? You never get ripped off, you're never significantly disappointed, and you never get the shits, okay? But, you know, you think I'm joking, but actually you're much more likely to get ill from a Michelin-starred restaurant than you are eating there, okay? In the absence of negatives, McDonald's is really, really fantastic. And I think it's a really important point, that, which is that, you know, quite often marketing problems, if you understand that variance question, people aren't moving their bank account even when you offer them 3% interest on their current account, because they know there's a 1% chance that if moving your current account goes wrong, your life is barely worth living, right? The goalkeepers taking penalty kicks to decide a kind of World Cup final, okay? They are more likely to score, obviously not all of them can do this, they're more likely to score if they welly the ball to the middle of the goal, to the top, and rely on the goalkeeper to dive either side. That's the single position with the highest chance of scoring a goal. Why are players so reluctant to do it? Because you look much stupider if you fail. Okay? Kick the ball left, goalkeeper goes left, you're unlucky. If you kick the ball down the middle, you're more likely to score, but if the goalkeeper manages to save it, you look like a dog. And so you actually have to encourage people to do this, because their natural instincts are about minimizing the worst case scenario, not just maximizing the average. And so in similar cases, we do work with Diageo, and one of the things we realized is that one of the reasons men will never order a cocktail in a bar unless the bar menu contains a picture or an illustration of the glass in which it's served. Because if the male brain thinks there's a 1% chance that it'll arrive in a hollowed out pineapple, he'll order a beer instead, okay? When you think about it, there's some really odd things about alcoholic drinks. A martini is about the most macho drink in the world as a drink, isn't it, right? Okay, it's basically neat gin with a bit of some other booze added, right? And yet it's served in a bloody glass where, unless you're auditioning for the next James Bond, you can't really stand credibly in a bar holding it without getting beaten up. Okay? You know, there's some really strange things going on there. Now, very quickly, because I must check time, because unfortunately, you see, because I live in Kent, I've got to get an earlier train back, otherwise I get stuck in London. Very simple thing to look at is lost choices, gained choices. One of the great things marketing can do is it can make a choice that people previously didn't have, or didn't notice, or didn't think about. It can make it salient and possible. And increase human wealth just by increasing the number of choices people can contemplate and then execute. Sometimes marketing works very cleverly by reducing choice. In a restaurant, you go in, they want to sell wine, you can mark up wine ridiculously. That's why they want to sell you wine, it's where all their profit comes from. You arrive, there are already wine glasses on the table, right? If you in fact say we're not having any wine, they take them away with a bit of a huff, don't they? Kind of like you're now a second-class customer, really. Okay? Then they bring you a drinks list, which isn't called the drinks list, is it? It's called the wine list. And the wine list contains 4 pages of different kinds of wine. And then there's like a little back page for the perverts and deviants who actually want to drink something that's been brewed or distilled. But then even cleverer still, they only bring one wine list. And they hand it to one guy. Now, there's only one drink you can share, other than, I suppose, tequila slammers all round, right? And so the second that guy gets the wine list, he turns to the rest of the table and goes, red or white? Or rosé if he's very kind of metrosexual, okay? And at that point, it's game over for the gin drinkers, game over for the beer drinkers. They're going to be drinking wine. And so understanding what's going on in the way that in many cases choices fail to become salient to us. It's a really interesting question about advertising. Are there products that don't sell simply because the moment at which they're considered justifiably doesn't yet exist? And so other things would be, this is an extraordinary case, the Nespresso Virtuo. They have 2 machines, the Virtuo and the Virtuo Plus. The Virtuo Plus is automatic and more sophisticated than the Virtuo, but they're selling them at exactly the same price. I emailed Nestle and said, you will never sell any machines under this condition, because if the human brain can't make sense of something, it won't buy it. If you have a product that's better than someone else's product, weirdly, even if you can manufacture it for less, you should probably charge more for it. Now, to an economist, better product, lower price is a total slam dunk. Higher utility, lower cost, easiest decision I've ever made. To the human brain, which has social intelligence, it goes, if that product were really better, he'd actually charge more for it. So the fact that it's cheaper probably means it has some hidden fault that I don't know about. It's why, interestingly, low-cost brands like low-cost airlines make a lot of noise about what you don't get. You know, you don't get a seat, you don't get a meal, you don't get, you don't get pre-allocated seating, you don't get your luggage checked in for free. It's to destigmatize the low price. Because if they say we're just as good as British Airways, but we're 2/3 the price, everybody goes, that probably means you don't service your engines and your pilots are all on day release from prison, okay? So weirdly, one of the strange roles of marketing is to actually emphasize negatives so that a low price becomes destigmatized. If you think about all those low-cost brands that are really successful, like, IKEA, they all do something that's like weird. IKEA makes it a spectacular pain in the arse to purchase the furniture, so you think you're saving money by suffering a whole load of pain and grief, not by getting inferior furniture. It's a really interesting stuff. This is why psychological problems. Why don't English people learn foreign languages? It's a choice problem, okay? If you're Dutch, one, you've got to learn a foreign language unless you want to spend your whole life in Holland. Or South Africa, I guess, because Dutch isn't going to do you any favors anywhere else. Two, it's really obvious deciding which language to learn first. Because lots of languages are useful, some places, English is kind of valuable everywhere. If you're English, suddenly that gets more difficult, right? It isn't absolutely obvious you need to learn a foreign language. Secondly, it's not obvious which one you should learn. You could spend 5 years learning Spanish and then get posted to Shanghai, where it does you no good whatsoever. Okay. Thirdly, if you want to learn Dutch as an English person, in order for it to be worthwhile, you don't just have to be quite good at speaking Dutch, you've got to be better at speaking Dutch than a Dutch person is at speaking English. And they've been watching English telly for the last 25 years. So unless you marry a Dutch girl and move to Holland, your chances of that are basically zero. Okay? So understanding, it's not true to say the English are bad at foreign languages, it's the English do not have the same choices to make that other people who speak different languages do. Equally, you can increase choices. If you want diversity at work, I'll be very quick on this, hire people in groups. Automatically, if you hire the only reason I got hired by Oglivy is they had 4 jobs. And they decided on 3 people and they said, we can't really decide on the 4th, so let's take a punt on the weirdo, effectively. Okay? If you hire people one at a time, if they had 4 people who each had a job, I wouldn't have got any of those 4 jobs. When you hire a group of people, you hire for complementarity and breadth. You don't hire for conformity. So you can achieve diversity aims in employment, not by installing quotas. It'll come totally naturally if you hire people 6 at a time. And you'll be prepared to take much. It's rather like, if you think about it, when everybody only had 1 car, everybody had a saloon car. Okay? When families have 2 cars, very few people have 2 saloon cars. In fact, often they don't even have 1. They have a small runabout and then they have some big thing, okay? Variance increases with the number of kind of choices you're making. So the weird thing is, consciously we don't understand this stuff at all. Unconsciously it affects our decision making massively. Consciously we're not aware of it. 1 times 7 isn't equal to 7 times 1. I'm sorry, I expected Mancunians when I attacked High Speed 2 to get really angry. I think you should have a high-speed railway, I just think it should go east. And maybe even to Liverpool, but that's too controversial, isn't it? Okay. Now, admittedly, it's not helped by the fact that all northerners hate each other, so connecting them by a high-speed railway might not actually have that many immediate gains, apart from the fact that you could now, at very high speed, travel to different towns and tell them how stupid they were. Okay. But the point is this. Okay. High-speed 1, where I live in Kent. Okay. That reduced the journey time from Canterbury from 90 minutes to 57. This means you can now live in Canterbury and commute to London, feasibly. Because what's happening there? One person is saving an hour 200 times a year. Now, to that one person, that's a huge deal. That's a behaviour-changing, opportunity-creating, total kind of earthquake in what they can now do. The problem with running a high-speed train from London to Manchester is that not many people travel to Manchester from London every day, okay? So you have a model for the time saving of high-speed 2, which looks just as impressive as high-speed 1, but this time it's 200 people saving an hour once a year. Now, that's still 200 hours saved, but they're not remotely the same. Now, once you understand that once you have humans involved, normal maths doesn't apply. 1 times 7 does not equal 7 times 1. That's why you need Amazon Prime, right? 10 people don't mind paying £3 for delivery once a month. One guy, even if he's really rich, isn't going to pay £3.50 for delivery 10 times a month. Okay? It's a huge mistake that economics and logic and mathematical models impose on humans, which is to treat, essentially, multiplication as if it's commutative. You know, I've actually suggested things to network rail with this, which is, look, 10 people who have to stand on a train 10% of the time is no big deal. One person who's got to stand on a train 100% of the time, that's a massive big deal. You need to discriminate, not just in, you need to discriminate at a granular level by looking at, you know, the fact that the 1 times 7 may matter a lot, 7 times 1 may not matter at all. And yet most mathematical models treat them as if they're exactly the same. You take my point. I mean, if you are coming from Manchester to London every single day, I'll be absolutely honest with you, you don't need a railway, you need an estate agent, okay? Right? Now, this is the kind of thing. Now, interestingly, I think, and I'm going to end here very quickly, I think you can use this behavioural insight to solve really interesting problems. You remember that thing I mentioned about the fox and the grapes? EasyJet, you know, the bus will take you right to passport control, adaptive preference formation. One of the great tricks I advise is ask really childish, stupid questions. Because sometimes when you ask those questions, no one's ever asked them before because they make you sound stupid. So I asked the question of a bunch of rail experts. I said, why do people mind standing on trains? Now, I don't mean for a 2-hour journey. That's a problem. Okay. I said, for a 30-minute journey. One, I noticed that quite often when seats become available, people who are standing up don't always sit down. Okay? But secondly, you know, people often choose to stand in pubs, for example. Why don't people like standing on trains? Everybody looked at me and said, I'm stupid. I said, no, because there are 5 possible, or more possible explanations, and the solution is totally different depending on which one it is. It might be because you feel cheated, okay? Because you've paid for a seat and you haven't got one. So although you don't actually mind standing up that much, it's the fact that the rail companies rip you off for charging you for something that you don't get. That can be solved by pricing. You have one carriage which is standing, and it's much cheaper. Okay? Another possibility is you can't use a phone and it's very tiring not falling over when you're standing on a moving platform, and because you've got to hold onto a pillar, you now can't use your phone, so you're really bored. Now I said, what if you redesigned a train so that there was a trade-off between standing and sitting, so the people who stood could actually claim they'd chosen to stand rather than having it imposed on them? Now the way you do that is, at the moment, the people who get the seats get the view out of the window, they get the table, they get the place to put their coffee, they get the comfortable place to sit, okay? They get all the good shit. The people who stand in the middle, they don't get a table, they've got nowhere to put their coffee, and they get all the crap, right? So move the seats into the middle of the train, okay, so they don't get a view. Have little standing booths alongside the windows, which each have a little table where you rest your bum, and they each have a little table with 2 USB ports, and you can put your laptop on them. Maybe people would actually say, actually I prefer to stand, it's only 35 minutes, I've been sitting at my desk all day. You can actually design choice so that everybody's happy. You've just got to make sure that there's a narrative they can tell themselves so that there's an upside to what they're doing. At the moment it's all downside. Hack choice and you can actually make everybody happy if the trade-off's right. Sweet spot, basically technology, evolutionary psychology, complexity economics, that's where to look for innovation, and often it's a combination of all three. I think one of my greatest examples of innovation, Uber, people talk about it as if it's an economic innovation. It's not, psychological. Totally changes the nature of waiting because you can watch the car approaching. It gives you exactly the right information at any point in your decision-making journey. When you ring a minicab firm, you have no idea whether they're going to say, I'll have a cab for you in 3 minutes, which is too early, or haven't got anything for the next hour. Okay? With Uber, you can see how likely you're going to have to wait before you make the commitment of actually booking or asking. Secondly, you can watch the cab approach. You remember what I said about certainty, okay? Thirdly, it's hugely dignified and ego boosting. Because it's, when you, I don't know if anybody else does this, you time your arrival on the pavement to coincide with the arrival of the car, which makes you feel like Kaiser Soze at the end of The Usual Suspects, okay? Fourthly, because you don't actually hand over any cash or ask for a receipt, it feels like a service, not like a transaction. There are about 6 or 7 things, if I had more time, I'd go into, where Uber changes the psychological experience of taking a cab far more than it changes the actual physical service. So much of that is actually psychological. Now, That is what I'm saying, is there are hundreds of ideas we could be generating if we freed ourselves only from looking at those problems that had a marketing budget attached. How we do that, I don't know. It will take time, but it needs to be done because, as I said, if logic were the answer, we would have solved the problem by now. So that's me. As after-sales service, I have to leave fairly rapidly. Any questions? Twitter is @RorySutherland, all one word. Very, very happy to answer questions, comments, abuse, or anything of that kind. And also, just to add that one vital point, that once you realize that actually the surviving problems are still problems because they're logic proof, okay? It should give you far more confidence to deploy the things you do brilliantly. After all, the logical people have probably already had a go and they've already failed. So don't apologize if you find it difficult, because the very fact that it's still a problem means that logic wasn't the answer. Thank you very much indeed. Oh. Oh. I better just... Oh, sorry about this. I better just dash for my...
He's come to get his Uber. I hope you all really enjoyed that. I can't answer questions, obviously. He's the only one who can answer them, but I hope you really did enjoy it. I'll just finish with saying thank you again for coming. Thanks for supporting NABS. There's some literature out on the tables if you've got space in your bags to take it with you, just to give you a bit more information. And as I say, please just get on the website, check us out, talk to me, get involved as much as you possibly can and spread the word. Thank you very much.